The 23rd of April is the feast day of St. George, patron saint of England. Welcome to Festal Footnotes. If you know anything about St. George, you probably know him as the English saint who slew a dragon. It would be lovely if either of those things were true. No one is entirely committed to St. George even having existed. But while the man's existence may be in question, the stories about him are legion. According to the stories, St. George was born sometime in the late 3rd century in Cappadocia, in Turkey. George's father died when the future saint was still an infant. Depending upon the story you read, the father died as a Christian martyr in an early persecution, or just died normally because people die sometimes, or didn't die at all and survived to St. George's adulthood, and thereafter St. George's mother took him back home to Lydda in Israel, where she was from, to raise him there, or maybe she didn't. Maybe she stayed in Cappadocia and raised him there. And when George became an adult, George joined the army and rose through the ranks to become a close personal advisor of the Emperor Diocletian, or maybe not Diocletian, but some other Roman emperor, or maybe not the Roman emperor, but some regional governor. We don't know. Have I mentioned there's a lot of different stories here? So okay, dragons. This is the story you've probably all heard, but it's a little more sophisticated. The story goes that George is traveling in Africa in what's now Libya. This is actually pretty plausible. The Mediterranean was deeply interconnected in George's time. It becomes less plausible when it turns out there's a dragon threatening a village. And the dragon is demanding sacrifices of people, or maybe just of young people, or maybe just of sheep, but the town ran out of sheep and so decided to try young people instead just to see if that worked. Regardless, the town drew lots to see which child would have to be sacrificed to the dragon. And the daughter of the local mayor, or king, or tribal governor, it depends, the daughter of the local leader is selected to be the sacrifice. It's a big deal. The woman is sitting outside the city, waiting to be eaten by the dragon, when suddenly, who should show up but St. George, riding on a white horse. Almost all art depicting this scene shows St. George killing the dragon, but that's not what any of the written versions say. Rather, the written versions claim that St. George tamed the dragon by the unusual method of throwing the princess's garter at the dragon. Or possibly, depending upon the story you read, asking the princess to throw her garter at the dragon. So, hot tip, if you are ever being threatened by a dragon that wants to eat people, you don't need to worry at all. All you have to do is throw a set of women's panties at the dragon and everything will be fine. I swear to God I am not making this up. Regardless, St. George leads the tamed dragon back to the town, or possibly has the princess lead the tamed dragon back to the town, and the townsfolk beg St. George to kill the dragon, and he agrees to do so if they all become Christian. Huzzah! Also, there's this delightful little coda that's sometimes added on, where the town offers him the hand in marriage of the princess and a bunch of money, and St. George refuses to marry the princess because he's taken a vow of celibacy, but he does take the money, and he immediately distributes it among the poor of the town. You'll see this mentioned in stories that want to emphasize St. George's purity. There's a completely different set of stories that surround St. George's martyrdom, and I'm not going to get into them here, but suffice it to say that a high-profile Christian in the emperor's direct service was an embarrassment. So the emperor offers St. George land and titles and wealth if only St. George will renounce Christianity. No dice. So the inevitable happens, and St. George is publicly tortured to death. But wait, there's a miracle. God resurrects St. George from the dead so he can be tortured to death again. I'm not saying it's the miracle I would have preferred in St. George's shoes, but it was a miracle. And so the emperor turns around and tortures St. George to death again, very publicly. And God raises St. George from the dead for another go-round. There are medieval sources that go into excruciating detail as to the details of this merry-go-round. We don't need to get in that. You really don't need to know. But suffice it to say that this goes on for several rounds, with the Emperor torturing St. George to death, and St. George being dead, and the Emperor being relieved, and then God raising St. George from the dead again for another go-round. Eventually, the Emperor decides to skip the torture and just chop George's head off, and the head stays off. Also, this story has a coda as well. The Emperor's wife, Saint Alexandra of Rome, who almost certainly never existed, but go with me here for a minute. She was so impressed by the show that she decided to convert to Christianity, which prompted the Emperor to execute his wife, like you do. Anyway, so this is a lovely set of stories, but the odds are that exactly 0 of them are true, so why should we care? Well, because St. George was a soldier. See, the Bible has some pretty specific things to say about killing people. And soldiers kill people. Or at least they have a profession which relies upon the idea that if a war were to break out, they might be called upon to kill people. And so the vast majority of early Christians took it as a given that to join the army was an inherently immoral act. An act that violated the Ten Commandments. We do have records of early Christian martyrs who were soldiers before their martyrdom. But in those cases, their conversion to Christianity, their renunciation of their profession, and their martyrdom were all wrapped up in a single dramatic act. They were martyred because they felt that if they became a Christian, they had to turn their back on the army. But then Constantine the Great happened. And suddenly, there were Christians in the army in large numbers, and someone needed to find a way to fix that cognitive dissonance, and stories of a saint who was very much associated with miracles, very much Christian, very much Roman, and very, very much a soldier. They were an excellent fit for doing exactly that. So, early on, St. George becomes the patron saint of the Roman army. Not the Roman Empire, just the Roman army. But bit by bit, his cult spreads across the Eastern Mediterranean. It's adopted by military men who want to be assured that they can be military and Christian at the same time. And because the kingdoms of the day were fundamentally tied up with their armies, slowly but surely, some of the people who adopt St. George's cult were kings. And so, early on, the Kingdom of Georgia adopts George as their patron saint. And then a little bit later, the Kingdom of Ethiopia adopts St. George as their patron saint when Christianity starts filtering down into Africa. And that's where things sit for a little bit. And then the Crusades happen. And feudal warrior kings from across Western Europe encounter this warrior saint from Israel for the first time, and they like what they see, and they take him home, and they make him patron saint of kingdoms across Europe, like England. See, St. George is a fascinating character, not so much for himself as for what he tells us about our inclination to tell stories and to want to hear stories that reflect our own image back at us. Whether there was an actual St. George is really open to question. It's possible there was an early Christian martyr named St. George who has had layers upon layers of stories added to his life as his tale has been told and retold through the years. It's also possible the whole thing was a myth from day one. And looking at old texts, you can see how St. George has changed as he's been used to tell the stories that people in different times and places needed to have told. As to patronage, St. George is the patron of a truly ludicrous number of countries. Either alone or in conjunction with a co-patron, St. George is the patron saint of Ethiopia, Palestine, Georgia, Turkey, Greece, Romania, Moldova, Russia, Lithuania, Germany, England, Malta, Catalonia, Aragon, Portugal, and South Africa, to say nothing of the cities of Beirut, Istanbul, Moscow, Ljubljana, Venice, Genoa, and London. Taken as a whole, Over 500 million people live in places which have St. George as their patron saint. Beyond this, unsurprisingly, St. George is the patron saint of soldiers in general and cavalry in specific, as well as Boy Scouts and anyone who works with horses. Not bad at all for a man who possibly didn't even exist.